Alternate Worlds here with my first ever video on this channel, and for this series I'll be creating what if Izuku was sent to the Pokemon verse. This will go on for a series, as I've said, so I do hope you enjoy. With all that being said, let's get into the video. Izuku would have his normal childhood up till the age of 4 years old. Izuku would get into an accident. This freak accident would cause young Izuku Midoriya to basically, fall into a comatose state because he was hit by a car. Quite tragic, as he would be in his comatose state for 4 long years. Not 4 actually, 2 long years. As when he finally would when he would finally end up waking up, he would already, when he found himself waking up, he would find himself in a forest. A forest where the first thing he saw was a weird looking bug creature that he had never seen before. As he wake up pretty freaked out, as a boy who was walking around would hear a scream and run towards it. As the boy would run towards Izuku, as he would say, "Hey, are you okay?" sticking out his hand. As Izuku would look up towards the boy with black hair and a tank top, he looked quite messy. As Izuku would look towards him and say, "Who are you and where am I?" As this young boy would reply saying, "My name is Ash Ketchum and we're in the forest. Don't you know? We're supposed to be in a summer camp with Professor Oak." As Izuku would look confused. Professor Oak? Summer camp? He'd never heard of this one before. As he would take the boy's hand and follow him back, as a girl would also be following them. As this girl looked like she fell over and injured herself. As Ash would hold both their hands and energetically run back towards Professor Oak. As Professor Oak would see the boys and the girl and would say, I take it you found yourself some friends, Ash." As Ash would smile brightly saying, "Yes, I have." As the camp would go quite similarly to normal, but with the exception of Izuku, as Izuku would hear what Professor Oak was teaching about Pokemon, what types there are, type matchups, things of that nature, as Izuku would be shocked, thinking that there are no such thing as quirks in this world. Seeing as Izuku was a young boy, he didn't get much of it. He didn't think he was sent to another world, but there was no other explanation, as Izuku has seen a few cartoons, or where he's from in Japan, anime of such things. So the only explanation for this is that he was either sent to another world or he died. But we're not going to think too deeply on that. We move on from this, as Izuku would end up growing in this new world, accepting the fact that he's now no longer striving to be a hero, but striving to be a champion in the Kanto region. As Izuku, though he doesn't have a home, scratch that. Izuku would end up having a home thanks to Ash Ketchum, because Ash would end up asking his mom, Delia, if they could take care of Izuku for a while till his parents come back from a business trip or whatnot. As Izuku would end up making a lie because he really didn't know what else to say, because he's technically not even from this world. So we'd end up making a lie about him his parents being from a different region, and his parents are on a business trip, and that he is currently just staying here for a little while. So Delia would accept and end up taking care of Izuku for the next few years of his life. As Ash and Izuku would end up growing up together, they'd end up being best of friends, basically like brothers. They would end up sharing a bed, sharing a bed because they had a bunk bed, and sharing the love of Pokemon and their interests and hobbies and stuff like that. of that nature, as the day would finally come when they are now the age of 10 years old and they are eligible to be Pokemon trainers. As Izuku in this timeline, seeing as, he doesn't know anything about this world, would end up studying very hard. He did. He studied to the point where he'd pass out day in and day out. Of course, Delia would tell him that's unhealthy and tell him to study at a moderate rate, as Izuku would do so. Izuku would end up knowing about this world a lot more than he did before. He'd end up knowing more about type matchups, or good Pokemon to train, or find, or try to capture. He'd end up finding out that there was a Pokemon League that he could challenge, and there was something called a champion, where he'd basically be the strongest trainer in this region. And Izuku would find that so interesting, as he'd say, "Champion, huh? That's so cool." We skip past that flashback, as Izuku would now hear his alarm that he set as it rings loudly. As Izuku would turn it off and scratch his eyes, saying, "I guess it's time to wake up." As he gets up, he sees Ash on the bottom bunk, rolling around in his bed, speaking about being a Pokemon trainer. Though he's not awake, he is currently, sleep talking. As Izuku would climb down from, his ladder, try to wake up Ash, and Ash would end up waking up, though not very easily, seeing as it took some time. But he'd end up waking him up anyways, as Izuku would tell him that it's time to get their first Pokemon. As Ash would wake up suddenly in lightning fast speeds, as he'd say, "That's right, it's time to get my first Pokemon." As Ash and Izuku would end up getting dressed and ready to go, as they'd end up walking out the house, telling Delia that they'll be back soon, real soon, as Ash and Izuku would end up running towards Professor Oak's lab even before Gary Oak, Professor Oak's grandson, could arrive. As he'd end up running towards Professor Oak's lab, they'd enter, yelling, Professor Oak, we're here to get our first Pokemon." As Professor Oak would be in his lab doing some research, as he'd stand up and take off his glasses, saying, "Oh, boys, I see you're the first two to arrive. Well, as they say, the early bird gets the worm. So, let's see. Which one of you would like to take your first pick out of these three starters?" As the three starters would appear from their Pokeballs: Bulbasaur, Squirtle, and Charmander. As Izuku would be in awe, and Ash would be jumping up and down saying, "Yeah! These Pokemon are so cool!" As Izuku would stare deeply into each of their eyes, thinking about which one he should pick. But Izuku would hold off, as he'd tap Ash's shoulder and tell him, "Hey Ash, why don't you choose your first Pokemon?" As Ash would smile, saying, "Thanks, Izuku," as he'd end up looking around and seeing a blue Pokemon with a shell, as he'd end up running towards it and picking it up and saying, "Hey, Squirtle, how would you like to be a part of my team? Or how would you like to join me?" As Squirtle would yell up his name, "Squirtle," as he'd hug Ash, as Ash would jump up and down saying, "Yeah, I got my first Pokemon." As Professor Oak would smile, saying, "Squirtle, eh? Good choice." As Ash would, end up running around with Squirtle, but Izuku would be in deep thought. He would think of which Pokemon is best fit for him. He'd look at Bulbasaur and he'd look back at Charmander. He'd look back and forth between the two. It was a tough choice, but Izuku would end up choosing Bulbasaur. As he would walk up to Bulbasaur, putting his hand out saying, "Bulbasaur, how would you like to join my team?" as Bulbasaur would yelp and jump towards him and lick his face as he'd giggle a little bit, as he was quite ticklish, as he'd say, "Yes, I got me my first Pokemon, Bulbasaur." As he'd take Bulbasaur's ball and find Squirtle's ball, as Ash would have forgotten it, and throw it towards Ash. Ash would catch it, a little surprised, saying, "Oh, thanks, Izuku, I forgot." As Ash would, chuckle and scratch the back of his head, Izuku would giggle a little and say, "Don't mention it." As they both walk out, thanking Professor Oak, but before they could leave, Professor Oak would hand both of these two their Pokedexes, as Professor Oak would quickly or briefly explain what these are, telling them that the Pokedex will scan the Pokemon, tell them what Pokemon it is, what type it is, maybe even some of its moves that it could possibly learn, and things of that nature, as Ash and Izuku would thank Professor Oak yet again and be on their way. As they leave, they end up seeing Gary, as Gary would be quite surprised that Ash catch him. The boy he knew since he was little, that was always late to everything, come early for once, and Izuku, that boy he's seen Ash hanging around with all the time. As Gary would smugly say, "Looks like you two finally got up early. Well, it doesn't really matter. I'm gonna get in there and choose my Pokemon. My Pokemon will be the strongest." As he'd end up walking away, leaving his signature "Smell you later," as Ash would be quite infuriated by this, and would really try and basically challenge Gary, but Izuku would tell him no, and tell him that they have to get back to Delia, and tell her about the Pokemon that they chose. As well, Ash thought that was a good idea and calmed right back down as they went back to, his house. They entered the house, and Delia would be quite surprised that they got back so fast, as Delia would see their two Pokemon, Squirtle and Bulbasaur, and she'd be quite impressed with the two of them, and she'd end up giving them 3 Pokeballs each, telling them that she stored these just in case they were to be Pokemon trainers, and she also gave them 2 potions just in case, 2 for each of them. As Ash and Izuku would end up walking out and head over to Route 1, as Ash and Bulbasaur, Ash and Bulbasaur, Izuku would let out Bulbasaur and basically let him walk beside himself. As Ash would see this and would basically say, "Oh, that's a good idea," and do the same thing and start bonding with each other. As Ash and Squirtle would start bonding, so would Bulbasaur and Izuku. But it wouldn't be long till they spot a Pokemon, as Ash would spot a Pidgey, as Ash would be quite excited since this would be his first Pokemon battle. As Ash would whip out his Pokedex, as he would see that this Pokemon is a Pidgey and it's a normal flying type. As Ash will tell Squirtle to get ready for battle, as Squirtle would get into his fighting stance, as Ash would use the Pokedex on Squirtle to find out what moves Squirtle would have. Squirtle's moveset currently would be Bubble, Tackle, and Rapid Spin. Those are its current moves so far. As Ash would quickly tell Squirtle to use a Bubble, as Squirtle will do so, releasing out Bubble or Water Bubble attacks at Pidgey, as Pidgey would be quite shocked by these attacks. And Ash would tell Squirtle to close in the distance and use its shell and use Tackle. As he'd do so, blindsiding Pidgey, as Pidgey would fall to the ground, almost unable to battle. As Ash would use one of his Pokeballs that his mother would give him and throw it at the Pidgey. The ball would end up shaking once, twice, and then 3 times, as Ash would end up catching a Pidgey, as Ash and Squirtle would celebrate and well, Izuku would end up clapping for him, saying, "Wow, good job. That was some pretty good battling out there." As Ash would tell him thanks, as then they'd continue on their way. But on their way, well, Izuku would end up spotting himself a nice catch. It was a female Nidoran. As well, Izuku would know what this is because he'd read up on books about Nidoran, as Nidoran could evolve into a Nidorina and a Nidoqueen. There's a male and female version of these. As he would see this Pokemon and think, well, this would be a good addition to the team, as he'd send Bulbasaur out to battle. As currently, Bulbasaur would have these moves, as Izuku would have checked earlier. As Bulbasaur's moves would have been Vine Whip, Razor Leaf, and, well, Growl. As he knew his moveset was, well, not really good for capturing or fighting this Nidorina. No, not Nidorino. Nidoran, my bad. As he knew his moveset and his typing is, well, not really good to face this Nidoran, but he believed in Bulbasaur anyways. He'd say or tell Bulbasaur to use Vine Whip to wrap around Nidoran, getting it with a surprise attack, as Nidoran was not expecting this, as Bulbasaur wrapped his Vine Whip around its hind legs, as it'd swing him round and round and slam him to the ground, as this would cause major damage, as it was quite a shock to Nidoran to be slammed like that, as Izuku wouldn't let up, telling him to use Razor Leaf, and this attack would land, as Nidoran would end up getting hit, but he'd get right back up, as he'd look quite angry, seeing as it was attacked out of nowhere, as Nidoran would rush forward, flying in with a poison sting, as Ash really did not like the look of that poison sting. Not Ash, but Izuku did not like the look of that poison sting, so he'd tell Bulbasaur to basically move out the way. As Bulbasaur would dodge, he would end up using a Growl, lowering his attack, or lowering Nidoran's attack, as Nidoran would shake it off and rush back in with a poison sting. But Bulbasaur would stop in its tracks with Vine Whip and slam it one more time, so it would be heavily weakened. And as Nidoran was heavily weakened and trying to get back up, Izuku would chuck a Pokeball straight at its head, as it would shake once, twice, 3 times, as the Pokeball would signify stars coming out of it, showing that Nidoran was caught. As Izuku would jump, "Hooray! I caught it!" So would Bulbasaur, as Ash and Squirtle would also celebrate with their 2 friends. As I think I might be leaving it off here for now. So hopefully you guys did enjoy.